Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I think I'd like to introduce sort of like a new chapter in all these videos that I'm doing on my channel. I think I'm going to still continue doing some of the true crime, but I kind of like to get a little more into a little away from psychology because I'm not a psychologist, actually. Okay, I have struggled with having a diagnosis of a cluster B personality disorder and having sort of, very difficult sort of recovery process. But myself, I'm not really that fascinated with how psychology presents, let's say, what we call personality disorders. And I'm not even really comfortable necessarily with the modalities of therapy as we know them. They haven't worked for me. And so I'd like to start talking about what's been really important in my life in terms of spirituality, art, and philosophy. Okay. I really think that spirituality, art, and philosophy are extremely related. And I'd like to kind of share sort of a possibility for everybody to think about, which is how we can look at spirituality through art. Okay. And really maybe try to understand spirituality as maybe less of a cartoonish sort of less as sort of like the cartoonish kind of supernatural sort of thing, which I think is just kind of a metaphorical way of thinking, and really to see how the spirits of the world, the spirits of our world, how the real spirits, how they really operate. Okay, and then to see how having a philosophy is not just appreciating spirits. Okay, in other words, all of us, even those of us who suffer from, like, say, addictions and behavior issues, and those of us who have even, let's say, a personality disorder or even subclinical, symptoms that are similar or close to a personality disorder, even though we may have our favorite TV shows and our favorite movies, um, and in any TV show or movie, we are sort of witness to spirits, because that's what makes good art, is that you're conjuring spirits. And so we may even have appreciation of spirits. Okay, but philosophy is when we actually take on and we burden ourselves with the actual lessons of the spirits. You know what I mean? What the spirits have to actually teach us. And we actually apply, spiritual insight, actually apply it to our lives. So I think that we always have to be really careful that it's not enough just to appreciate in the sense of enjoying art or spiritual expression, but there's that next step to actually take it into practice, which is, I think philosophy, the word philosophy only makes sense when we take ideas and put them into practice. Okay. And so in a sense, philosophy is something that we actually live, and it's more than just appreciating things. So in a sense, maybe we could look at spirits as like the inspiration. Maybe we could look at art as a way of presenting spirits to us in a creative way, you know. But philosophy is when these ideas and these notions actually get put into practice. Okay. And that to me is more like athletics, because that's like the real conditioning of actually going through the grind of actually, taking, like, say, spiritual insight and spiritual inspiration and actually applying it to life, because that's where we're going to actually have to take a load, and actually really play the sport of life. So in any case, I'd like to start with like three basic inspirations for me, as a way of sort of explaining to people, how I look at spirituality. And I look at it through art, but it doesn't have to be through art. It can actually be through, I guess, just meditation or just appreciation of life in general. But I guess three vehicles that I'd like to sort of explore closely, to sort of describe, how I see spirits and art and spirits in art, are actually three interesting, what I think are masterpieces of sort of 20th century art. And I think before I get into these three examples, I'm going to say that I'm really inspired by great writers. Okay, some of the best writers for me of the 20th century have been, like, say, Henry Miller, just because I think he's very very vivid, and really presents the turmoil of life. And I think anybody with cluster B is going to understand the turmoil that's presented in Henry Miller. Okay, And so he's very vivid in presenting, the real turmoil of our spiritual life. Um, Another person that I'm really inspired by would be, let's see, um, really inspired by Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut, because I think he also has a real sense of the spirits, the American spirits. And I guess another one would be, what is it? I'm sorry, I just the one who wrote The Great Santini. Why is that name escaping me? Terrible. Oh, what is it? It's terrible. He's from South Carolina. He's Pat Conroy. Pat Conroy. Another person who really presents the spirits of the emotional struggles of American people through the point of view of, this is an interesting concept. Kurt Vonnegut is a very powerful visionary. And he was asked one time, about what it was like growing up in Indiana, and he was kind of trying to explain what the spirits of Indiana are like, And Indiana's kind of middle America, but it's like it has its own kind of special sort of, I guess, its own history and its own sort of atmosphere. And he described people from Indiana as being freshwater people, freshwater people. And it's funny because anybody who knows, anybody who can identify with Kurt Vonnegut will instantly know what he means when he says freshwater people, especially if you've grown up in the United States like I have. I grew up in the 70s, and, my life was sort of like my life in a way, I guess my childhood, it was kind of like a pastiche, or sort of like a montage of, a lot of fishing, a lot of hiking in the woods, just kind of looking back on it, very kind of laid back activities, playing baseball, but just really just kind of, I would say, very low impact, kind of harmless, non-venomous, non-venomous activity. Also, those of us who like snakes, in the United States, in the old days, it wasn't that hard to find snakes, and very, very quickly you learn the difference between the vipers, the pit vipers, the poisonous snakes, and then the more docile animals, like a green snake or like a garter snake, and then the intermediates, the constrictors, like your king snakes or your rat snakes. Like the rat snake that's like big constrictor. That's like almost on the level of like a boa constrictor, squeeze your arm and stuff. But you kind of learn that in the gallery of animals, reptiles, whatever, they're the ones that are a little more aggressive, a little more dangerous, and then the more kind of docile animals. And I think, when I think of Kurt Vonnegut talking about freshwater people in Indiana, I kind of get the contrast between, the copperheads, the cottonmouths, the rattlesnakes, and then the green snakes, the garter snakes, whatever. You kind of get that feeling that maybe Indiana is kind of like the green snake of the U.S., kind of. So that's kind of my understanding of freshwater people. And, I can remember, I think there were a lot of freshwater spirits in my family. I can't say we were 100% freshwater. I think my dad, looking back, my dad has some freshwater characteristics, but my dad is also kind of a fighter and maybe kind of a competitive person. So I don't know if he's 100% freshwater, but our family definitely had freshwater spirits, and I can relate to that as an American, And so as we look in our world and we meditate, I guess I just believe that there's a lot of wisdom in the spirits, because the spirits are not just temperament. The spirits are also kind of a perspective, And I think that somehow, I guess, in our psychology, I think the spirits of the world, they kind of present us with a very powerful vision. And from that vision, okay, because each spirit has a different perspective and vision, okay? And I think the freshwater spirits, because they are kind of docile and, not too aggressive, I think there is a little more room for vision, and sort of a peaceful vision. And I think a vision of reconciliation. And so all that is sort of crystallized in the power of the freshwater person. You know what I mean? And that's a spirit, and I think, by itself, there's not a lot of magic that the spirit can do, because just appreciating it, that doesn't put you through the exercise, And I think philosophy is when we put ourselves through the exercise of taking on the vision and applying it in our lives. And that's, what it's one thing to have a vision of reconciliation, but what does it mean to have reconciliation sitting inside of you? That's where you're going to have the real drama. And now the drama is not what you watch the people on the screen, now it's inside of you. And that's where we take it to the field and we actually get exercise. And I think a lot of people are very strong in spiritual appreciation, spiritual identification. We know, like say, identify with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Pittsburgh Steelers, that's dark colors, right? That's coal, that's Pittsburgh. That's it has a lot that goes with it. The Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh Steelers, the color, the dark color, the association with coal, with Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania and that steel mill, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, the coal, you got to get the coal to run the steel mill, but then you got to smelt the steel, and that is hardcore. That's not fresh water. Okay, the Pittsburgh Steelers is not fresh water. But then you got the Dallas Cowboys, different color, different sunshine in Dallas, all these things are the spirit, and so when you say, I identify with the Pittsburgh Steelers or identify with the Dallas Cowboys, we don't realize we're identifying with a whole different vision and a different spiritual perspective, and these are very powerful things. But it's one thing to just appreciate them, and we all identify. There are people that they're just born and they just identify with the Denver Broncos. They identify with hunters, with country music, with chewing tobacco, or all these different things. We can identify, or having a lot of tattoos, smoking a lot of pot, whatever. We all identify with different spiritual perspectives, okay? But how often do we take on the perspective, And I guess I just like to propose that, ever since Ronald Reagan was not a freshwater person, okay? I mean, you can say what you want. He was from the Midwest. He grew up being like a swimming lifeguard and became like a radio announcer. But he was not a freshwater person. He was visionary, I think Ronald Reagan was actually very similar to Ayn Rand, kind of had a very libertarian and eventually kind of a conservative sort of point of view. And I guess, he believed in freedom in a certain sense, I guess, but he was kind of like another type of American. He wasn't the freshwater American. Okay. Maybe Jimmy Carter at least represented more freshwater America, in some sense. And so in a sense, going from Carter to Reagan and having that nasty interference of the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, I think we sort of killed the 70s. There was that terrible revolution against disco, towards 78, 79. I can't remember exactly. Then you had the hostage crisis in Iran. And these are kind of like the percussive announcements and the percussive signifiers that sort of killed the 70s, killed the sunshine. 70s was very sunshine. It was very relaxed. The long hair was also relaxation. It was a laid back quality, and these are spiritual qualities. Okay. And so you get this percussive shock, with these dark events, these very black events, the hostage crisis, Ayatollah Khomeini. And then suddenly you get this turmoil, and I guess the world spirits are commanding something else. And I guess somehow Ronald Reagan is wanted, and Jimmy Carter just kind of goes away, and the 70s and the sunshine just kind of goes away, and suddenly you're born into the 80s and you got new spirits, and it's a different spiritual world. And I guess, the important thing to remember is that, because you move into a different era, okay, it's not like the freshwater perspective is just going to die. It's not going to die, but it becomes non-dominant. You know what I mean? So like the Reagan perspective, heavy capitalism, just a different harshness, a different sunshine, a different light, different kind of light, a different kind of vision, a different kind of way of relating to people. It doesn't mean that the freshwater disappeared, but the freshwater people are just kind of like, we're the non-dominant. We're now the minority, or even kind of the invisible. We're not really. It's kind of hard. There were some exceptions. I found David Letterman to be kind of a freshwater person. Okay. And I think he was even from Indiana, And I think who was that funny guy that was always on David Letterman? Chris Elliott. Chris Elliott. You have to look this up. If you guys don't know Chris Elliott, you got to look him up. That guy is so off the wall. He's so mediocre. He's so imperfect, and so freshwater. I mean, freshwater person all the way. People call them slackers, whatever. But Chris Farley, to me, and David Letterman, they kind of maintain a little bit of the freshwater vibe, I guess, throughout the '80s. But it was really sort of, it was sort of like after late night. It was sort of like it wasn't prime time, you know what I mean? And so it was really sort of a non-dominant spiritual voice, a spiritual vision. And so especially I think in post-Reagan America, I think we just went through a whole gallery of spirits, all through even, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Obama, anything but not freshwater America. That was just sort of lost in Indiana, I guess, But the bottom line is, it's an important American spirit because I think it's one of the best spirits of reconciliation. And I think even like Mark Twain, I think Mark Twain was kind of a freshwater American. He had a more peaceful, reconciliatory kind of spirit. Like look at how he was so compassionate in his description of Black people. At a time when that was maybe kind of unusual, and talking about his childhood in freshwater America. I think it was Missouri, but, hey, that's freshwater. And just the way he kind of grew up in the river and, making friends with Black people and just kind of having his neighborhood antics. And, that to me is the freshwater America, and I think it kind of got lost after the '70s, but I think it's a very important perspective because I think for Americans, I think it really crystallizes for the American heart, a vision where we can at least have the possibility of reconciliatory processing. Okay, and I think that's very important to people who struggle with the cluster B and narcissistic or narcissistic adjacent or similar issues, because sometimes exactly what's missing in our dialectics and our dialectical processing is precisely that aspect of reconciliation. Okay. Now, just because you appreciate the freshwater perspective, that doesn't mean that you've internalized it or that you've gone through life with the consequences of reconciliation. Reconciliation actually it causes a lot of turmoil, a lot of grind, a lot of pain, and so to have the appreciation of the spirit, or the appreciation of the art and identifying with it, that doesn't mean that you've gone into the philosophy of it, which is where you take it on and condition yourself on the inspiration of the spirit, where the spirit now becomes kind of incarnated in one. Now I don't believe in spiritual magic in the sense that I don't believe that just appreciating a spirit can just inhabit you. I believe there are possessions because I believe people can become possessed by spirits, but that doesn't mean we reach the philosophical point where it becomes incarnated fully. Okay. In other words, I think a possession is not a full incarnation. I think it's a non-philosophical incarnation in the sense that, or not even an incarnation, it's more of it inhabits you. So like when we're let's say, and I feel like I've been inhabited by, or let's say possessed by different spirits, of course, but they don't incarnate completely because they're not, how would you say, they're not taken in philosophically. They just sort of inhabit you, and it's sort of an incomplete inhabitation, basically, So I just challenge people to consider that, not to be satisfied with just being, let's say, inspired by a spirit or identifying with the spirit, but actually, getting to the point where you take on the spirit, really take it on, not just inhabited by it or by the superficialities of it, but really take on the consequences of a spiritual position. And I think, that is where philosophy takes place. That's where we actually take the spirit, have spirits and actually take the burden of the spirit, and really live the burden of the spirit. And I think one of the best burdens and the most difficult burdens, I think, of the freshwater perspective is what it actually means to take the notion of reconciliation, but to take it on in the heart and in the guts, and actually to take on the grind and the discomfort of reconciliation. That is, I think, where we begin to give birth to philosophy, because we actually are incarnating the spirit, and the inspirations of the spirit in our lives. So as we talk about Freshwater America, then, and the Freshwater American spirits, the big inspirations that come to my mind, okay, are I think three particular. One is the Rockford Files. Okay, anybody who knows the Rockford Files knows that was more than just a TV show. Okay, that TV show, and it's more than just Stephen J. Cannell. Stephen J. Cannell was sort of like the creative source of the Rockford Files. I mean, he really sort of came up with the whole, the character. I guess if not the character, at least he came up with the basic story and the basic dynamics of the characters and the vision. And, I don't think Stephen J. Cannell is necessarily the most, I don't know if he's a perfect freshwater person. I think he was sort of a California person. He was sort of a California sun-kissed kind of 70s kind of person. But I think Stephen J. Cannell, I think he knew the spirits of the America. I think he knew and he loved the American spirits. And I think you can't just create something. Okay, this is the thing too. When you're an artist, you don't just create. What you do is you bring the spirits, the spirits, and you bring them into vision, and you bring the spirits into people, And so I think what Stephen J. Cannell was doing is I think he was tuning in. And I think beyond all the muck of the Vietnam and the hippies and all this stuff, I think he noticed in all that storm of politics that there was sort of a missing, sort of a freshwater America that was sort of kind of quietly, not really very visible necessarily, and yet very common. It's just not, the freshwater America doesn't really raise its voice that much, And so I think he kind of saw the spirit, the freshwater spirit. And I think it probably helped a lot to have the example of James Garner. James Garner, I don't know if he thought of James Garner when he wrote it, but James Garner, I think even if he's not perfectly freshwater, I think James Garner also knows America, and he knows how to conjure a lot of the freshwater America. And I think it was just a magical combination of actors and writers. And for whatever reason, I think Stephen J. Cannell was able to really conjure what I think is the freshwater spirit. And it was perfect for the 70s because the sunshine was just right in the 70s. 70s had a different sunshine, and it wasn't because the sun was different, it's because the spirits were different, and when you have a different spirit, the sunshine is different, And so I think that for whatever reason, I think Stephen J. Cannell, he didn't create the freshwater American, but I think he found a place to make it he found a place to show it and present it at a time when it was really a wonderful time to have that in the context of like Ray Chandler's Los Angeles, basically. So it's kind of like this hard-boiled Los Angeles, but with this freshwater spirit, and also with sort of the 70s sunshine, basically, and 70s, and just a lot of other 70s spirits, sort of like the street sort of criminogenic, criminal, sort of mild criminal street spirits of Los Angeles, but just bringing all these 70s spirits into a setting that was sort of like Raymond Chandler's hard-boiled detective, whatever. So anyway, so I think that the Rockford Files is actually one of the most complex masterpieces of spiritual wizardry that I've ever seen, at least from the 1970s. And I think it's I mean, I'm sorry, if you really look into it, because it's so shabby and it's so imperfect, and the Rockford Files is so, I guess, just unglamorous, that it's really hard to see how complex and how much wizardry is going on with the presentation of American spirits. I think it's really easy to underestimate. And so, while I've always appreciated and identified with the Rockford Files, it's always been a barrier to me as a person struggling with cluster B and narcissism and stuff. It's always been a barrier to me to then take on the consequences of all that spiritual richness and actually take it on in my life and not just appreciate it. So I think in my case, I think I was very tuned into the spirituality of it. And I was very tuned into the artistry of it. But I think I was very weak in the area of philosophy, because I think I always understood philosophy to be abstract. And I think it never occurred to me that philosophy doesn't become real until the spirits are actually incarnated in the consequences as we live with those spirits and actually take them on, and take on these gifts, these gifts of our nation, of our spiritual universe, basically, and take these gifts and actually make them come alive in our lives, which is not just appreciation. You know what I mean? And so I want to use sort of the vehicle of the Rockford Files as I think a kind of almost like a shamanic, or sort of like a magical spiritual vehicle, to talk about what philosophy really means and how we can sort of gain healing, I think, because what use are the spirits if we don't put them into a healing? You know what I mean? They're just appreciations. So I want to try to maybe suggest ways that we can sort of take inspiration from these spirits to make a difference, in our lives, to actually bring them into our lives and make them come alive. You know what I mean? And so anyway, so the Rockford Files is number one, and then also to me also is The Night of the Iguana, which is it's a 1962 movie, or a 1963, I think, 63 or 64, whatever. It's like, Kennedy was assassinated while they were making Night of the Iguana, so it must have been 64. But anyway, it was 1964. John Huston directed an adaptation of Tennessee Williams' play, The Night of the Iguana, which is really, to me, just an amazing wizardry of American spirits. Because Tennessee Williams, he knew the American spirits, and he was able to bring lots of American spirits together into one tight space. And that is major drama, because if anybody knows the American spirits, okay, what about, like, say, the American spirit of, like, say, the prudish, religious, female religious, sexually frustrated, put that together with, like, say, a Freshwater American, or let's say a Freshwater American in downfall, in sexual downfall, just all these things together. And there are lots of other spirits in The Night of the Iguana, but basically it's just a wizardry, because, like Stephen J. Cannell, Tennessee Williams just knew the American spirits, and he was able to put them all together in one small space, a little bit kind of like what Breaking Bad did, because Breaking Bad sort of took the American spirit of, let's say, the boring anonymous teacher, high school teacher, person who has no money, no status, and sort of brings that together with, like, the idea of cooking methamphetamine. I mean, just crazy, but in a funny way. Tennessee Williams does the same thing with a former preacher, like an Episcopal reverend who, has, like, say, a life crisis, and then ends up having to live like as a tour guide in Mexico, And so in a sense, it is sort of the same kind of situation, where it's sort of like a Walter White, but it's just not in the sense of going like full like Scarface, but still just kind of putting him in a different spiritual context. And so I think it's kind of the same level of creativity. And then the other one, let's see, I've got Night of the Iguana, Rockford Files. And then the other one was, let's see here, I've got it. I don't know why I forgot it. Terrible. Man, my memory, I must be having Alzheimer's. That's terrible. God. Oh, yeah. This is a masterpiece. This was a retro noir movie from 1981 called Body Heat. Okay. And again, this is sort of bringing in the best of, like, say, the world of the hard-boiled film noir, sort of that kind of atmosphere. If you guys want, it's sort of like taking from, like, James Cain, I think, or Cain, the guy who wrote the Double Indemnity. It's basically inspired by Double Indemnity. But through the vehicle of William Hurt, who's a great, a great artist, really bringing, I think, a freshwater person into the world of the hard-boiled world. So also the movie Body Heat. So I'm going to use those three masterpieces kind of as a place to talk about, not so much about psychological theory, but about the actual spirits the real spirits, and how spirits can potentially become philosophies for us, you know. And I